y un saludo desde este foro mundial, Global Deal. Me llamo Nosy y Nosy Zabala y es un privilegio para mí estar en este tercer día del foro de alto nivel Global Deal. A lo largo de los días que ya han tenido lugar, hemos abarcado distintas facetas del diálogo social en el marco del mercado laboral. El día 1, el lunes, abarcamos este tema analizándolo desde distintas perspectivas. Concretamente, dedicamos el debate a cómo podríamos construir o podremos construir una recuperación sólida con puestos de trabajo inclusivos. Ayer tuvimos una sesión excelente en la que analizamos el diálogo social en el contexto de las cadenas de suministro y hubo reflexiones muy valiosas. Una de ellas, muy pertinente para la reunión de hoy o la sesión de hoy, insiste en la importancia de concentrarse en la diligencia debida como uno de los mecanismos para que el diálogo social
importance of understanding supply chains and the different vulnerable groups within those supply chains, from women to migrant workers. Of course, we also spoke about the informal workers and what social dialogue looks like and means and should mean for them. So we had a really robust conversation. All of that, ladies and gentlemen, leads us to today. Today, we are really addressing inequalities, and we're having a specific focus on social dialogue and due diligence. Now, we have followed a format of the last two sessions that I believe has worked incredibly. We're going to keep to the same format today, and that means we're going to kick off with some opening remarks. Right from there, we're going to make our way into a scene setter, and following our scene setter, we're going to segue into a robust and insightful panel discussion, and our panelists are standing by, and I'm keen to introduce them very shortly. As always, we want to extend an invitation to you to send us your questions, send us your comments during the panel discussion, and we will do our best to integrate your voice into this conversation and make sure that your comments and your questions also have a place and space in the dialogue that we are having today. For those of you who are going to be following this conversation on social media and amplifying it to the world, we really welcome that. We're using two hashtags to do that. That is hashtag Global Deal Forum and hashtag social dialogue. As always, we aim for a really inclusive conversation. So you will note that there is interpretation in English, French, and Spanish, and we encourage you to follow in the language that is most comfortable for you. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say this. Your voice in this forum is critically important, and it is the way in which you contribute to the global deal, and it is the way in which you too can make a difference. And so it's such a privilege that all our partners have come together, from governments, from business, from trade unions, to not only join in on the partnership, but also to join in on the conversation. And so with that being said, allow me to introduce our opening speaker. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Her Excellency Elizabeth Borne, the Minister of Labour, Employment and Economic Inclusion from France. She has also previously served as Minister for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition, and was also Minister with responsibility for transport, which was attached to the Minister for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition. And so without further ado, to extend her opening remarks, please help me welcome the Minister. Minister Borne, the floor is yours, Madame.
Thank you very much. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Écoutez, moi je me réjouis de rencontrer aujourd'hui, même si ce n'est encore que virtuellement, les membres du Global Deal et l'ensemble des partenaires réunis lors de
Good morning, good afternoon. Depending on where you are in the world, it's a pleasure for me to welcome the people from the Global Deal. I want to thank all of you, and especially the organizers, the Secretary General of OECD, first and foremost, for having been the initiative of this forum, Mr. Guy Ryder, the ILO, the Swedish government that has provided strong support to the Global Deal for a number of years, and the various players who are also participating. I also wanted to also acknowledge Madame Pénicaud and Christy Hoffman from Global Union. Soon we will be celebrating the 3 years of the decision to create the unit Global Deal with OECD and the ILO, and the 4th anniversary of the launch of the French platform, the Global Deal. I wanted to take this opportunity to welcome all of you and to salute the realizations we've achieved in the last 3 years. I also wanted to take the opportunity to come back to the reasons for France's support to the Global Deal initiative. In France, as you know, we attach a great deal of importance to social dialogue. We feel it's very important to consult the social partners and to have global collective bargaining. The pandemic has shown, if it was still necessary to do so, how important it is to have social dialogue in order to be able to make quick decisions as close as possible to the needs, taking into account the specificities of each sector. The government in France has also carried out its own social agenda based on social dialogue. Let me give you a few examples. In terms of social health and hygiene in the workplace, the social partners have come to an agreement very quickly, and at the end of 2020, a remote working agreement was reached. These are 2 examples of the vitality of social dialogue in France. We are convinced that social dialogue will be essential in the future in order to ensure recovery at the national and international level. Our economy and world of work are changing very deeply as a result of the digitalization of work, and the crisis has only made things more marked, and social dialogue will be essential if we want to succeed with this transformation. We've therefore set up a framework to support companies and employees in this transformation process. As part of this framework, an agreement has to be signed within companies to identify those jobs that are at risk and help employees learn new skills so that they can find new jobs. This is part of the focus we put on transformation and social dialogue. I would also like to refer to the regulation of platform work. And we've identified the social responsibility of these platforms. We are convinced that rather than having solutions imposed from outside, we think that social dialogue can create a more secure framework that is better adapted to the situation of workers who work for social media platforms. This is one of the very important aspects of social dialogue. We felt that it was appropriate for France to support social dialogue on the international level, and has therefore joined the Global Deal and created the French platform. I wanted to take the opportunity of this meeting to recognize what has been achieved in the last 3 years. I know that during this meeting, you've exchanged on a number of lessons learned and good practices and that a number of publications have been discussed, and especially on social dialogue during the pandemic. The Global Deal has made it possible to exchange on various practices between governments, between companies, between trade unions, between NGOs on international challenges in order to identify value added. I wanted to recognize Jean Sassiveras here in France, who was there for the session yesterday and who presented the platform which was presented at the G7 last year, which has enabled us to promote a number of initiatives on social dialogue. And I would like to conclude, therefore, with a few words on the presidency, which will begin in January 22, France's presidency of the European Union. As I said, I'm committed to making social dialogue a major issue during that presidency. A number of important issues will be discussed. I'm thinking about the planned directive on minimum wage in Europe and the commitment to collective bargaining. I'm thinking about the planned directive on wage transparency. This is very important to achieve equality between men and women. And in this respect, we need the cooperation of the social partners. We also have a new law in France that was adopted in 2017. This on due diligence. This will be implemented in the next few months at the European level, and it could inspire other regions. We need the support of social partners in order to reinforce due diligence. I would also like to refer to the global deal, which is an excellent way to take into account both social aspect and economic aspects. The global deal is exactly what we need for our economies and our societies. I'm convinced that the exchanges we have today will enable us to reinforce and develop this initiative. I wish you some very interesting exchanges.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. That is, of course, ladies and gentlemen, Minister Elizabeth Bourne, reminding us of the importance of social dialogue. And it's almost building on some of the comments that Mr. Guy Ryder made yesterday. He described it as a problem-solving mechanism. And as we listen to you talking about how social dialogue allows us to make quick decisions, not only in the face of the pandemic, but also as we prepare for the future challenges that are certainly going to be making their way to us. You've also reminded us about the importance, of course, of local solutions that match the realities on the ground, and how social dialogue enables us to make sure that any response and any solution really is a mirror of the real challenge and the real reality on the ground. It's encouraging in this conversation to also hear your commitment of putting social dialogue firmly on the agenda as France takes its presidency of the European Union. Madame, thank you very much for those opening remarks. I think you've done an incredible job of beginning to set the scene for us, but to build on that scene. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Mark Anna. He is a professor of labor and employment relations at Pennsylvania State University and the founding director of the Center for Global Workers' Rights. He also directs the university's master's program in labor and global workers' rights, and his work, ladies and gentlemen, focuses on purchasing practices and global supply chains, and he examines trade unions, employer, and government strategies for addressing decent work deficits. So, Professor Anna, we are absolutely privileged and honored to have you extending some of the framing for the panel discussion that will follow. Allow me to open the floor and to hand over to you.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this session with such distinguished speakers. And it's just been a really rich conversation so far. I've followed as many sessions as I could. So today we're going to be talking, of course, about social dialogue and due diligence. For me, to talk about due diligence is to talk about global supply chains. And I listened very attentively to the excellent session yesterday on this topic. So I see us today expanding that discussion to see how we can build back better, not just by creating jobs, but by creating good jobs, jobs with dignity. To do that, to explore solutions, it's first necessary to set the context, which includes reviewing the challenges presented by global supply chains that due diligence seeks to address. Let me start by emphasizing something I think we all know well. Employment relations systems are national. However, when we bring global supply chains into the picture, we are dealing with a situation in which decisions are made up supply chains and thus outside national institutional context, and they impact national level employment relations dynamics. This is particularly true for the most vulnerable workers at the bottom of supply chains. Now, allow me to put up some slides just to illustrate some of my points. Let me know. Is that working?
We can see that. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So on purchasing practices, you mentioned this is a big theme for me in my research. I'd like to emphasize 3 practices and how those 3 practices can influence employment relations practices at the national level. The first is a squeeze on price, and the data is very clear on this. You could see that's actual data for imports of garments to the US. Put simply, make the shirt for me for $3. A year later, talking about competitive dynamics and such, and saying, okay, now you need to make the shirt for $2.90. And then we can draw that out year after year. The second purchasing practice, if I can get this to go, is speed to market. We all have heard about fast fashion. It's endemic in the industry. We need these products quickly to meet consumer demand. The next purchasing practice is order fluctuation. And again, this is influenced by consumer demand. I need 100,000 units. No, I need 25,000. No, I need 75,000 units. So this creates enormous challenges at the national level for employment relations practices. And again, I'll emphasize a few here. Low wages. We see this throughout these supply chains, particularly in garments, but in many others. And here we are, many years later, still discussing how do we get to living wages. The other dynamic is work intensity. And this is something I've spent a lot of time studying in India and elsewhere. When you can't bring wages down, or there's minimum wage legislation, the response is often to increase hourly production targets. And if you do that year after year, you're eventually going to get to a point where it's just not humanly possible to meet those targets. And what can happen in that context is an increase in verbal abuse by supervisors, yelling at workers to go faster, and this can lead to gender-based violence. And lastly, we see practices of union avoidance, companies doing everything in their power, this concern that in this hyper-competitive context, unions will push to raise wages and stabilize shifts. So there's an emphasis in some cases to avoid unions. Now, COVID, of course, as we all know, just greatly exacerbated all of these trends. It started with those abrupt order cancellations back in March 2020. Employers spoke out very forcefully about this. That was, I believe, largely addressed. Afterwards, and this is some of my research, again, looking at trade data, we did see a very intense price squeeze. In fact, the price squeeze here year on year was going down by 13%, which suppliers are being paid to make these products. Other trends, eventually this leads to, has been well documented, the hunger in the supply chains, a lot of unemployment, a lot of workers, even shifting from permanent contracts to temporary contracts, a reduction in hours of work, and so on. Okay, that sets the context. Getting up to what I really want to focus on now is how do we work our way out of this? And I think we need to start with the most fundamental building block. And I want to say this, I think all the building blocks to work our way out of this are already there. We just need to put them in place more clearly and more deliberately so that they can interact and reinforce each other. So here for me is the most important building block of all, collective bargaining. And here I'd like to emphasize inclusive and encompassing collective bargaining. Inclusive means that it's not just about bargaining for the privileged few permanent workers, but for all workers associated with the production process, men and women, formal and informal, citizens and migrants. And I would also like to add people with disabilities. And what about encompassing bargaining? Encompassing bargaining means getting beyond enterprise bargaining to cover as many workplaces as possible. either through industry-wide bargaining or pattern bargaining, however you can get there. Now, this is all good for the national context, but as we discussed, we are dealing with global supply chains, which means we need to bring buyers into the picture in what I'm calling triangular bargaining. This means the only way we can ensure that purchasing practices made by buyers at the top of global supply chains allow for decent work at the bottom. Put simply, when the buyer sets a price point to make a shirt or a pen or a phone, they must be able to show that price point is sufficient to cover the total cost of decent work, living wages, proper benefits, safe buildings, etc. So how do we achieve all this? How do we get buyers into the process? Unions have been doing this for years through global framework agreements, which I believe can be expanded to become multi-actor global binding agreements, such as the Bangladesh Accord. This is a structured, negotiated mechanism for bringing buyers into the social dialogue process. Other examples of this process, we now, of course, have the International Accord. I think the Lesotho agreements are very important, which focus on gender-based violence at work and freedom of association rights. There's also the Washington Agreement, which was signed with unions in Fruit of the Loom in Honduras. And I think this is an understudied agreement. And something I studied recently is also in the banana sector. You have global framework agreements with Chiquita and so on that are important. Let me just illustrate the impact of that Washington Agreement in Honduras. Here we have a case. There was an attempt to form a union. The factory was closed. It was a big campaign. And it results in this really dynamic process of social dialogue with the union and Fruit of the Loom. And Fruit of the Loom in that process agrees to not only reopen the factory and recognize the union, it agrees to neutrality. And with that, the union just grows in Honduras, but very interestingly expands to other companies, Haynes, Gildan, and so on. I believe right now, from my research, Honduras probably has the most unionized sector with some of the strongest collective bargaining agreements, truly independent unions. And here's just a research project I'm doing now. In category after category after category, workers are much better off when they're covered by these collective bargaining agreements. I want to illustrate one point from my research on Guatemala. This was the last research I did before COVID hit. I was literally returning from Guatemala in March 2020. It was a long survey, and people are interested, I could share the full report. But here's one data point from that, unionized with collective bargaining versus no union, no collective bargaining. In this case, 58% of women without union and collective bargaining protection report sexual harassment on the job versus 8% of women in the unionized setting. And with those 8%, very importantly, those women told me in those cases, they had a mechanism set up through the collective bargaining agreement that allowed them to address those. And they said, in some cases, supervisors were dismissed. So how do we now bring in due diligence to all this story? I think due diligence plays a very, very crucial role, has the potential to play a very crucial role in this. Not only because it's mandatory, also I think the way due diligence is going now, it's growing in scope. So a lot of firms, not just the largest, are being covered, but it very clearly brings in freedom of association rights. And I think this can really help us build that model of inclusive, encompassing collective bargaining. It reinforces the process. So to conclude, let me just say this: due diligence by itself will not be a solution to all the challenges workers face. However, it can be a crucial component in efforts to empower workers to put into their hands the tools they need to achieve dignity at work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Anna. And I think taking your comments and your scene-setting remarks and pulling them together with what we've heard from Minister Baum, the stage is set for us to have a really, really robust conversation. We've heard the opportunity for due diligence to really contribute to the creation of decent work. We've heard you loud and clearly saying, by itself, clearly insufficient, but an important component in getting that right. Yesterday, Mr. Guy Ryder invited us to not shy away from putting inequality at the center of the conversation. And certainly we're hearing from both of what you said, the opportunity here to address those inequalities, but also the unsaid opportunity for business to become increasingly aware of the challenges and vulnerabilities in their supply chains and the risks inherent and the ability to then respond. Of course, we're going to discuss the mandatory element. We're going to discuss the opportunity to grow in scope, but all of this are setting the stage very beautifully for us. And so allow me maybe to introduce the panel. It's such a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, that we have with us the Minister of Labor and Social Security from Chile. That's Minister Patricio Melero. Minister, thank you for being here. We're looking forward to listening in to the Chilean experience. We've got Madame Sanda Ojiambo with us. She is, of course, the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, and we obviously follow that work quite closely. And so we're interested in some of the positioning that the UN Global Compact has taken around due diligence. We've got Madame Sarah Norell with us. She is the Director of Assortment, Purchasing and Supply Chains at System Bulligat. And again, as we're listening to Professor Anna talking to us about those purchasing practices, I know that Sarah is probably going to have some input and insights around that conversation. We've got Madame Christy Hoffman. Welcome to you, Christy. She is the General Secretary of UNI Global Union. And so we're keen to hear the role of trade unions, as Professor Anna talks about the opportunity of inclusive and encompassing collective bargaining. I'm sure you're going to have some insights for us there. We also have Madame Nyagoe Nyongo, who is the CEO of Fair Trade Global. And so we're really going to be leaning into her to understand some of those complexities that sit within supply chains and the role of due diligence therein. So we have a stellar panel, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen. And so maybe with that, let me kick off by going to the Minister. Minister Melero, let me come to you. You know, one of the things that Professor Anna spoke about is mandatory due diligence. And we know that in several jurisdictions in the world, there is an intention to make due diligence mandatory. And in some jurisdictions, this has already happened. And there's an expectation that this would somewhat tilt the playing field for international business in favor of MNEs that put responsible business first or put it at the core of their strategy. The question to you, Minister, is what is your view on this as a labor minister when it comes to human and labor rights? Over to you, Minister.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you, to all of the members of this panel. I would like to thank the Global Deal for inviting me to speak here today, and I would like to thank the OECD and Global Deal for organizing this, and I would like to also acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Labor from France, and also I would like to thank Professor Anna for his words, and you, Ms. Shabalala, for moderating the session. Human and labor rights are the foundations of the labor market, understood as basic values that companies have to comply with. Respect for labor rights is not only important, but is an added value to production. Corporate responsibility must be understood as a commitment taken within any company and in the context of that company. This includes the supply chains. Corporate social responsibility should not be understood as philanthropy or charity or social aid, not at all, but as effective actions that have the aim to guarantee a social, economic, and environmental sustainability of the operations of companies and all of the groups that are part of the production process. for Chile, it is very important for companies to constantly improve the standards with which they operate. And due diligence is a necessary part of these practices. This, however, presents a certain number of challenges, particularly when we want to take it to the level of small and medium enterprises that have less resources to live up to the standards set internationally. Another challenge is how can we make sure that these policies flow from the bigger groups to also becoming a reality for SMEs, so from MNEs to SMEs. For a good transition, we need to make sure that we incorporate a stricter obligation of due diligence in business conduct with a ability to apply it gradually and make sure that these policies and practices can adapt to specific places where they are enacted. We also need state support for this to happen, and public-private partnerships can play a very strong role in the application of these policies that enshrine or that defend, above all, human and labor rights of workers. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much for listing those very candid remarks. And what stands out as we're listening in is how due diligence and social dialogue more broadly is not philanthropy, but it actually is a pathway to business sustainability. You've also raised some of the challenges that that play themselves out in the small and medium-sized enterprise space, and us to be thinking very deliberately about how we ensure that, as Professor Anna talks about inclusive, that is not limited to MNEs, but it also extends itself to SMEs as well, and those international standards find expression in that space as well. And the reality of gradual state-supported processes is certainly something that is going to receive attention in this conversation. But let's go to another strong supporter of mandatory human rights and due diligence. And that's, of course, the UN Global Compact. And so, Sanda, as I come to you, we know that the Global Compact is a strong supporter of mandatory human rights due diligence, and in fact, argues that only relying on involuntary initiatives is just not enough. Question to you is, can you tell us just a little bit more on the background of this position and why you would draw the line at saying, actually, voluntary is not enough, mandatory is where we need to go?
Great, thank you, Nazipo, thank you. And I just want to, echo a lot of the sentiment from the previous speakers. I think they help really build on to this question. Mark spoke about, we're looking at not just jobs, but jobs with dignity. The Minister of Chile has just spoken about the importance of that public-private partnership. So that really lays the foundation for my comments here. At the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights last November, the Global Compact issued a statement of support for all legislative efforts regarding mandatory human rights due diligence. The thinking then, and still remains, that voluntary measures alone will not get us where we need to be to really meet this important corporate responsibility or business responsibility, as is described in the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And the principles do call on governments to implement a smart mix of measures that's voluntary, mandatory, national, and international to really foster business respect for human rights. The guiding principles were adopted in the year 2011, and a number of states have adopted domestic laws implementing human rights due diligence, including recent legislation from the European Union, as we know. And indeed, the guiding principles have led to important achievements, but we need to do more. I think Mark's slides were very insightful, demonstrating really that the pandemic also continues to shift what some of these, challenges are around human rights, and that's one instance in time. So we're definitely not in a foolproof situation. So the fact of the matter is that businesses must really develop ongoing processes to identify, to prevent, and to mitigate adverse human rights impacts. For us, this is important. It's central to the mission of the Global Compact and our 10 principles, because we believe that companies that focus on protecting human rights and labor standards will cultivate positive relationships with their stakeholders. So for us, the other big challenge that we see is truly accountability. And that's why we know that voluntary measures alone just don't make the cut. We see companies having great corporate aspiration, but there's a gap between that aspiration and action. And so we're also calling companies to account by reviewing our reporting framework, we call it the communication on progress, to really foster accountability and track performance. We want businesses to truly understand how they can respect, promote, and support human rights to that regard. So I think I just want to say that, recognizing human rights is a fundamental prerequisite. We do see significant gaps between ambition and action. And given really the gravity of the situation, our position is that that smart mix of both mandatory as well as voluntary is really critical to be able to address what we must do. Human rights is really not an act of goodwill or charity. It's really about, as we talked about, fundamental dignity of the human being.
Sandra, it's very, very strong front-footed. We need to close the gap between ambition and action. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're not tweeting these sound bites, I'm not sure what you're telling the rest of the world, but because these are the sound bites that are coming to the surface. But what I'm hearing you saying is that the smart mix allows us to do more. We're not yet foolproof. You've spoken about how due diligence brings into sharp focus that accountability that enables identification, mitigation, and prevention of human rights abuses within supply chains. Now, I think this all sounds incredible. So let me be a little bit difficult. Christy, let me come to you with that difficulty. And that is, how do we make sure that due diligence for responsible businesses actually works? How do we make sure that this is not a tick boxing exercise? As Sandra talks about a reporting framework and holding each other to account, how do we ensure that this reporting frameworks that we roll out are real, they are a reflection of the impact in the ground, and that this is not tick boxing in any way?
Thanks, Nosy. I'd like to be very practical with my answer to your question, because this is something that, we as a global union are grappling with every day. We, think that the mandatory due diligence is absolutely essential. We don't think this will happen on its own. We don't think that this will happen without a mandatory approach. But then what do we do with that mandatory due diligence to make sure that it does translate into changes on the ground? And we want to be very practical about it. Uni Global Union represents workers in the service industries. So the employers we have that are primarily not directly in the supply chain, as Mark described, although we are a signatory and founder of the Bangladesh Accord and do work in that domain. But primarily, we have employers that are, giant grocery store chains or outsourcing companies for call centers that operate all over the world in some of the countries that are at highest risk for human rights violations for workers. So we're not naive about the local conditions. So what does that mean to go into a due diligence process? First is risk mapping. And we think we bring a very important perspective to the risk mapping, because we know where there are the most highest likelihood of violations, where there are current problems. And we can offer some very concrete steps towards reducing the risk, remediating the problem. And we also understand what it means that when it comes to respect for the rights of workers to engage in collective bargaining, it's not just a question of announcing a new policy. It means shifting the culture, embedding the practices of managers who are often told from the very beginning of their careers that a union is bad news. So for Uni, we have some experience and are indeed pressing for more, that we want to be engaged in. How do we retrain the managers with new messages, which are different? Can we do joint trainings with workers and managers so that the workers see that the employer is not hostile to unions? We would much prefer to work in depth in some countries, do the risk mapping and make some concrete progress, than do a sweeping overview with no real progress at all. And that's sort of the alternative we're often presented with is, here's the plan, hope you like it. This is not the kind of due diligence we want. We think we need to go into the weeds and figure out specific remediation strategies for separate workplaces, for separate countries. And we've had great experience when we were able to do that.
Christy, I love the practical nature of the responses that you spoken to us. Risk mapping, so we know the likelihood of where the hotspots are. You speak about joint training, where you have the worker and the managers, and that becomes part of the way where we undo some of that cultural conditioning that underpins that relationship. But also what I'm hearing you saying is that we need to move away from spray painting. We need to go into the weeds, I think, with the words you use, and really understand those issues. So Dr. Nyagoi, let me put this question to you. We've heard Sandra speaking about the gap between ambition and action. Christy is saying to us, there are very practical ways in which we can overcome the tick boxing. I'm interested to hear from you around how do we ensure that we close the gap between paper and practice? And maybe you can also touch on the recent study that was done, commissioned by Fair Trade, that really speaks to how do we go about actually closing this gap so that business that is really wanting to embrace due diligence is able to translate from paper into practice. Over to you, Madam.
Thank you, Nozi. Actually, when I was listening to Mark at the end of his speech, I thought, okay, I have nothing to say really, because all that he says resonates so well with what we do at Fair Trade. But anyway,
Madam, if I can just pause you for a second, there's somebody that's unmuted and we want to hear you very clearly. If I can please ask, I think the colleague Pilar, if you could please kindly mute your microphone. We want to hear Madam Nyagoi really, really clearly as she responds. I think it is one of our translation booths. If somebody can get that message through for me, I would really, really appreciate that. All right, Madam, let's give you the opportunity to continue.
Okay, thank you, Nozi. We must remember, as has been said, that due diligence is an instrument, not a goal. And it can only work if implemented correctly. So this is why social dialogue continues to be key. It positions stakeholders as right holders, because if you are dialoguing with rights holders, how can you know how to tackle or mitigate violations present in your value chain? How can you know what risks to address without engaging and verifying with the rights holders? Social dialogue brings the voices, knowledge, and experience of these farmers and workers that we work with that are really at the bottom of the value chain. It brings them to the discussion on human rights in a meaningful way, and it helps build trust within the value chain if there is social dialogue. Furthermore, I must say that social dialogue is needed in order for farmers and workers not to be burdened with the responsibility of shouldering the cost of due diligence. The cost of due diligence should be shared all across the value chain, because then if you involve the farmers and workers in social dialogue, it enables them to have the ability to negotiate in the international marketplace. So social dialogue also ensures that buyers and traders don't cut and run, taking human rights violations elsewhere when faced with certain pressures, because you find that oftentimes that the buyers may cut and run. Some will abandon their sourcing partners at their hour of need, pursuing cost savings and profit maximization. And as we've seen, as has been mentioned, we've seen this happen during this COVID crisis, when buyers and companies have defaulted on their contractual commitments, maybe when they had long-term contracts with the farmers and workers. During the period of COVID, these contracts, there have been a lot of defaults in the contracts. I must say that at Fair Trade, we are really calling others for action to put that smallholder farmer, that worker, in the front and center of due diligence. Otherwise, we are really not going to achieve much when it comes to matters of due diligence. It's only through true social dialogue can the opportunities in global trade be leveraged to generate great impact on human rights and to reduce poverty that we aim to do as a global movement.
Dr. Nyagoi, you've gotten to the heart of the issue. It is all about building trust. It is all about creating space so that there's voice and that voice can be exercised. It is all about knowledge and awareness. You cannot act or manage something that you're not aware of. And that message is coming through loud and clearly. And it's such an interesting perspective as you talk about that translation from paper to practice and how practical it is. Sarah, having listened to the conversation, because we know that System Bolagat you've been doing this. You have been implementing a process of human rights due diligence since 2018. Maybe your voice at this point becomes critically important. What experiences do you have with engaging stakeholders such as workers and trade unions in your process of due diligence? We've listened and heard a lot of the caution about what could happen if we don't get it right. We also want to hear, when you do get it right, what does it look like?
Yes, thank you so much. I want to start with the quote, ambition needs action, and that's really what it's all about. Systembolaget is one of the larger buyers within the drink trade, and we want to be a driving force when it comes to sustainability, especially for the people involved in the supply chain. And this is because I want it, the company wants it, but also our customers, our employees, and our owners, the Swedish government. We have a very complex supply chain, and to achieve traceability, which I think you need to know your supply chain, we have implemented a due diligence process that enables us to, by using our digital supply chain mapping tool, we collect information about actors in our supply chain, information that's relevant to the most critical risks. Currently, there are more than 4,500 actors, our suppliers, their producers and growers, supplying information about, for example, their certification. This can be fair trade, or it can be whether they are unionized or not, and if they use temporary labor. In this way, we can assess producer-specific risk, but also identify regional risk patterns. However, we also wanted to make use of the eyes and the ears on the ground in order to have relevant information on what is really happening in the supply chain. So we have partnered with different stakeholders, and in 2017, the union at Systembolaget, our company, opened the doors for us to start a dialogue with their international partner, IUF. So we signed a memorandum of understanding that specifies that we will work together on human rights issues in our supply chain. In practice, we have together developed a reporting channel to be used by local unions in, for example, the wine producing areas in South Africa. It works like this. The local union files a report to the local contact person at IUF. The local contact person of IUF ensures that the report contains enough information for us at Systembolaget to be able to act on. IUF in Geneva ensures the report is aligned with our memorandum and sends it to Systembolaget. We can, in our turn, contact the commercial partners and initiate action based on our code of conduct and general terms and conditions. Remedial actions are decided together with all partners of the memorandum and the local union and the producer as well as our supplier. So the process allows us to link the local union's knowledge and information on what is happening on the ground to our purchasing power and leverage to push for improvements. Another important aspect of this is that it allows us to receive feedback whether agreed remedial actions actually have been put in place, something we have been struggling with in the past.
Sure. This panel has really taken this rather big conversation and just made it so practical. I think, Professor Anna, one of the things you spoke about, you said the building blocks are there. Now it is about just activating those building blocks. And this is exactly what we're hearing. So Sarah, thank you very much for just taking the time to talk to us about when you talk about traceability, what does that mean exactly, and how you're using that digital mapping tool, how you're closing that feedback loop, and the clarity of what could happen. One of the beautiful things is that when we listen in to examples like this, we get the sense of the component parts of that best practice and are able to then replicate that in context in other areas. Now, I want to do a couple of things. One of those things is that I want to go into a second round of questions with my panelists. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, to you, our audience, I want to bring your voice in. So I am going to favor the audience voice. What that means is that I'm going to put my panelists under immense pressure at this time to make sure that they are concise and to the point and really brief in their responses so we can bring the audience voice in. So let me make my way back to Minister Milero. Minister, you spoke really powerfully about the importance of really understanding that due diligence is not philanthropy. It enables corporates and businesses to really live up to their commitments. My question to you, Minister, is what is the role of social dialogue in assisting business to live up to their commitments of being a responsible business? Over to you, Minister.
Muchas gracias, Nosy.
Thank you, Nozi, for that question. Well, policies and social dialogue at a national level are basic for businesses to live to their commitments of responsible business, as I said. And in this context, we believe that building public policies based on processes where the different stakeholders, social stakeholders, can collaborate are basic for sustainability and long-term results. Precisely, in the framework of the updating of labor legislation, we have tools that need to be based on certainty and legal security, promoting protection of jobs, security of employers, and on the other hand, productivity and efficiency of the businesses. To create this certainty, this security based on dialogue is our main goal, while assisting businesses to live up to their commitments. Legal certainty and security are the right way to find the way to live up to commitments and rules, to make them a reality, not just paper. Actually, no legal framework in the world now can forget cooperation, social dialogue, due diligence. This is why reinforcing bodies and tools that promote dialogue, the updating of supervising bodies, the prosecution of fraud, and the reinforcement of those bodies that are directed to implement rules are essential to promote trust and mutual dialogue. We also believe that it is possible to move from the antagonistic approach in labor relationships to a holistic approach where workers and businesses need each other in a complementary way to achieve their goals in a collaborative approach. Dialogue needs to be non-confrontational. Our contemporary reality invites us to create a modern labor relationship based on consensus and agreements in order to have businesses that are long-term sustainable and are capable of updating and upskilling workers. Those are our policies from Chile, based also on other countries' experiences that we could learn from OECD and others. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. And as we listen to you talking about one of the component ways in which we build trust is through legal certainty. But beyond that, listening to you saying the importance of that regulatory environment, the importance of the judicial capability, the importance of prosecution. But what I'm also hearing you say, Minister, that it need not always be antagonistic, that there is a place and there is a world where we are holistically working together towards that common goal. Christy, I think you would find this all very interesting, because as I come to you with the next question, having listened to the Minister, what would you suggest to policymakers to include in their due diligence legislation, especially if it comes to promoting the role of social dialogue in due diligence legislation? We're talking about legal certainty now. What should policymakers be focusing on?
Thanks. Well, I'll be brief as you requested, and I have 3 points. And the first is that, as Sarah said and Mark said earlier, let's recognize and support the role that global agreements can play to lift due diligence, because we are the eyes and the ears on the ground. We're in 150 countries, and these agreements can really give a push to due diligence and a reality and a viability that it makes a big improvement. So I think recognizing the Bangladesh Accord, but also global agreements, we have about 50 at UNI, and they're central on due diligence. They can be central, and the second is that legislators need to recognize the role of unions in the due diligence process. There's a lot of language that talks about stakeholder consultation. That does not mean coming with a completely done report and putting it on the table and saying, what do you think? That is not engaging unions in the risk mapping, in which we're very central, but even more important in the remediation. And so we are at that stage where some companies we deal with are just starting in their due diligence, and they think that's the way it works, and it isn't. And we don't want to see over-reliance on social audit companies. We've seen that in the past in the supply chain. That's not a credible, viable step forward. And so we're not doing due diligence just to create a new cottage industry for social audit companies. And the last thing is that we need to make sure, and this is rarely done, but we need to make sure that the rights of freedom of association and bargaining are considered salient rights. Because very often a due diligence plan only deals with the salient rights. And so they only, and often, we've seen employers say, well, that only includes child labor and forced labor and maybe a little bit of safety and health. No, that is wrong. We need to make it clear that the rights to bargaining and association to organize are salient rights, and they should be treated as enabling important rights to enable so much else to which people are entitled. So those are my 3 things. Thank you.
Christy, I think they're excellent. One of the reasons is that they build on a very important conversation I had yesterday on the international accord, and we really listened into how that came about, how it has been executed within the supply chains. It was really good to have Leila Etter from H&M, who drives the sustainability agenda, actually speaking to this reality. And of course, what I'm hearing you say here is that when we're looking at the role of unions, how inclusive is it really? I mean, Professor Anna said, when we're saying inclusion, and maybe we need to unpack what inclusive collective bargaining is. And it's not just sending you the report, but it's having your fingerprints on it and having your voice integrated into it. And I mean, I love the point about this is not about creating new revenue streams for social audit consultants in the main. And suppose I get to your final point, and Dr. Nyagoya, I think you'll be very interested again in what Christy said in a final point, which is talking about salient rights. And I want to bring the next question to you on the back of that. Can you describe for us, Dr. Nyagoya, a concrete example of how dialogue and stakeholder engagement can really drive the human rights agenda forward, especially in the context of high-risk agricultural supply chains? Let's bring your voice in today.
Thanks, Nazi. Social dialogue is a critical facet of our policy work and its successful implementation. When it comes to prevention of child labor, for example, it is key that the community is completely on board. Without their will to enact cultural change, child labor cannot be eliminated from our midst. This is especially true since no organization can monitor 365 days, 24/7, what is happening in agricultural communities. Now, I'll take the example of Belize. A full 94% of sugarcane produced in the Belizean district of Corazon and Orange Walk is fair trade certified. And yet, in 2013, a survey showed an increasing rate of children's employment in agriculture. Belizean law is neither consistent with international standards on hazardous work, nor our standard of minimum age of employment in sugarcane, which is 18 years. So when the fair trade certified Belize Sugarcane Farm Association was found non-compliant by our certification body and suspended, it was issued with corrective actions. The association then worked quite closely with us to take action to correct the issue of child labor. In 2015, they became one of the first Belizean produce organization to implement our youth inclusive community-based monitoring and remediation system, alongside an internal control system, of course, for the elimination of child labor. Then using the system's findings, the association launched the first ever multi-stakeholder social dialogue forum on child labor in Belize sugarcane production, with participants from farmers groups, the government of Belize, US, Mexico, and Honduras, the ILO, UNICEF, National Teachers Union, industry, civil society, and others. In 2018, the association then embarked on an EU-funded project to study child labor and youth well-being in sugarcane. The study employed this youth inclusive system and generated farmer inputs into a hazardous child labor list for the sugarcane sector in Belize. So here's an example of how fair trade and its certified produce organization have been instrumental in contributing to evidence-based social change, social dialogue, and spotlighting the views of involved farmers, workers, and their families. The work in Belize illustrates the progress that can be made when small produce organizations and involved youth are enabled to lead the fight against child labor within inclusive systems. Since 2015, if I may tell you, the association has not only reported less incidents of child labor, but has also publicly called upon its new government to rigorously enforce its child labor standards in the sugarcane sector of Orange Walk and Corazon.
Sure. Dr. Nyagoe, it's such a beautiful illustration of true inclusion, one, but also, when we really get to the root cause, I think it was Minister Bourne right at the beginning who spoke to us about the importance of really getting to understanding the local reality on the ground. And as you're saying here, when there's an empowerment and inclusion of the community, you really begin to see those community members owning the process and showing up from the process. I think one of the other things that you've said that really caught my attention was evidence-based social dialogue. And so again, back to Sarah's initial example that she gave us of how they really deploy their mapping tool, the importance of information, the importance of data, so that one truly understands what is actually happening in the supply chain. And we're not spray painting in large brushstrokes, but we actually have that understanding. I think it was Professor Anna who spoke about getting into the weeds, if I'm not mistaken there. So maybe, Sarah, let me come to you. And the question really for you is to really understand what actions have you taken as an organization to now strengthen social dialogue and to address the issue of poor working conditions. I particularly want to bring in the Italian vineyards that you are sourcing from. Let's listen in, because one of the things that Sandra spoke about, she said, we need to keep our sleeves rolled up because we're not foolproof. We always need to look at ways of improving. So we're keen to understand what that looks like from a System Bulegat perspective.
Thank you, Nancy. Yes, as we understood earlier, we have a systematic process and tools in place to quantitatively identify risk. This allows us to run a long-term improvement work with our supply chain through audits, field visits, and capacity building. However, we also know that our supply chains are long, complex, and often involves 100 different growers in one bottle. So we sometimes struggle to reach workers at the grower level where we know that human rights violations are bigger. Even if previous audits had shown that there were risks for human rights violations in Italy, as well as in other countries, we also assume that audit as a method does not always find some of the most severe violations. So therefore, we decided to work together with Oxfam to conduct the human rights impact assessment as a natural next step after doing the human rights due diligence in the Italian supply chain, since Italy stands for the largest wine volume sold in our market. And it is really an advantage to use external experts like Oxfam and the unions to use their local networks. They can reach the workers directly without always having to involve the employer. So the final report we just received after summer, it consists of two parts. It's to more deeply identify the risks and recommendations on how Systembolaget can improve our processes for a more positive impact. So some of the identified violations were that there are forced labor due to workers paying for their employment. There are insufficient wages, lack of grievance mechanism, lack of freedom of association. So some of the actions taken by us at Systembolaget, and some of them were already in progress, is that we've implemented the framework for sustainable purchasing practices. I think this is what Professor Anner talked about when he talked about purchasing practices, what to avoid, what to focus on. We've also developed capacity building programs on sustainable purchasing for us internally, but also for our suppliers to support them. We also have a new shelf label on sustainable products for a more holistic approach where to help the consumers to do more of informed choices. And we are in the process of making more human rights impact assessment in our supply chain. So this full report now, it's fully transparent and it's on our website. And we wanted to be transparent, obviously, with the challenges we face, to allow us to drive change together with the industry, but also so that stakeholders can hold us accountable and help us to improve.
Sarah, thank you very much. So we're not only hearing an embracing of accountability and being held to account, but also the courage to reach out to other partners that enable a much more authentic implementation of due diligence, and those external partners who are able to go directly to the workers where they're at, which is just absolutely so important. So what has happened is that our audience has begun to send through some really excellent questions. I'm going to try and get through as many of them as possible. Christy, I did notice that you had already started responding to one, so I'm going to bring it to you right now because I think this is a great question. And the question is, an often heard argument in the discussion on human rights, due diligence, and global supply chains is that certain practices, especially when it comes to including workers' voices, are not always part of local culture and local traditions. Is this your experience? And how do we deal with this, overcoming local conditioning and local cultures and experiences? Your thoughts on that, Christy?
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, that is something we hear all the time. Well, we just don't like unions in whatever the country may be. And if I name a few, I'll be accused of leaving out others. But there's so many countries where having collective bargaining right now is not a norm in that country in this moment. And I would include the United States in that group. It's very, very hard to achieve a new union in the United States. And even, this week I was talking about a company with a European company, then they just said, look, I mean, our managers just won't agree with it. We can't persuade our managers. Were trained from, the moment they went into business that they were not to allow a union. So we can't push that through. We obviously cannot accept that rationale. These are fundamental rights. And that same argument could apply to so many other rights that we all hold dearly. So we can't accept that. These are fundamental rights. You can't just say we care about fundamental rights in countries where they are already accepted. Why do we need the recognition of rights if we're only going to do it where it's easy? So that's one point for us, is that really it matters what you do when it's hard. And when it's hard, it doesn't matter what you do in France where collective bargaining, of course it matters, but that's not our biggest objective, is to work around the edges of countries that have already have these well-established practices. We really need to look at countries where this is not the norm and figure out strategies for overcoming that. And there's many examples of companies that have overcome that, which does involve deep cultural shift with their local managers. It does involve training. It does involve a clear message from the global company that this is not accepted, and we need to move forward together with some kind of program to make a shift. I don't say that it's easy, but it is possible. There are plenty of examples, and I would never accept the argument that, no, this isn't the way we do it in, Bangladesh or whatever country it might be. This isn't how we do it. I've heard that every day. I mean, every week, for not exaggerating. And, this is what we're up against, but it's just something we can't accept.
Dr. Nyagor, you're nodding, and I would imagine that you have some thoughts on this. So let me bring you into this idea. I mean, one of the things that's struck me as you were speaking about the example of child labor is also maybe the cultural practices within communities where it is normal to send children to work on farms because it's part of the cultural practice. Now, I'm hearing Christy talking about how we need to challenge cultural practices and cultural norms within the workplace. How relevant is that within communities, so that communities are part of the solution rather than enabling and also contributing to the problem?
I really agree with Christy's answer to that question. And I would just like to add that it's not the norm. Child labor is not the norm in communities. We have to look at the systemic causes of child labor. It's poverty. There's no parent in any part of the world that would want to send their child to the farm instead of going to school. There's no parent who'd want to give a heavy load to a child when it's not as detrimental to their health. So we should be addressing the causes of child labor and not saying that it is the norm in certain societies. The norm would be that, yes, in every society, a child works during school holidays, a child works during weekend, but a child does light work. That's in all our societies world over. But in terms of child labor that is detrimental to the health of the child, or child labor that keeps the child away from the school, it is not just as simple as that. There are causes to it. It's the poverty. It is in the bias, for example, in the agricultural supply chain, not paying fair prices to the farmers. And so the farmers do not have a living income that they're able to have enough resources to pay for labor.
Dr. Nyagor, I think it's an excellent answer, because what it does, I think it was Christy's words to say that we can't shy away from the hard things, and oftentimes the easier thing to do is to leave it at, this is the norm in the society, this is the culture, and the hard thing to do is to go beneath the surface and understand how the impact of paying farmers below the wages that contribute as fair is actually a big contributor to how this happens. And I think it's such an important cultural conversation that we're having at this time. I want to go to Minister Malero. Minister, there's a question here from Meluska. Oh, it's just run away from my screen. From Meluska Rakami, who is advisor to the Social Economic Council in Curacao. Now, Meluska is saying unions can accelerate adherence to human rights by facilitating legal actions against the violators of human rights. And he goes on to say, this is very important given the difference in power between the bigger companies and the workers at the bottom of those supply chains. But given the interests, is this enough? And really, I think it's such a big question. And because you spoke about the importance of legal instruments, the importance of making sure that even as we talk about big companies, we don't lose sight not only of smaller companies, but we don't lose sight of the workers at the bottom of the supply chain. Given interests, is that enough, is Maluska's question to you, Minister.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta de Meluska. La verdad que antes que denuncias.
Thank you very much for that question from Meluska. When we talk about reporting human rights abuses, well, even before that, in Chile, we really believe in tripartite dialogue. We believe in understanding before confrontation, as a way of preventing confrontation as well. And in line with what the ILO says, tripartite dialogue between workers, employers, and governments. The best way to prevent human rights or labor rights violations is having a tripartite dialogue that has legislation that supports it in terms of union rights, in terms of the rights and responsibilities of employers and workers. Our unionization rate in Chile is quite low. It's around 13%. We are not proud of that figure because we need to increase it and improve that situation. With low level of unionization, there is less protection for rights in a broad sense. And as you know, Chile is well known as a copper producer worldwide. The mining sector is quite large in our economy. In the mining sector, unionization rates are around 90%. But in small and medium enterprises, unionization rates are quite low. This is something that also pertains to legal certainty and to understanding the pathways for a dialogue. This, of course, helps foster a dialogue if all of that exists. We must understand the sectorial and not political nature of unions, of trade unions. Sometimes the social dialogue can flounder with when the dialogue is permeated with the issues that divide the workers themselves from a political point of view. So we must avoid politicization of these fora. Politicization goes against understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. And I think it's quite a big topic. And as you speak about the politicization, and maybe Sanda, I want to bring it to you because I think this question from Maluska is a very good question. One would imagine that when a recourse through the courts and through prosecution has now come into play, that it does impact the relationship between business and the trade union. And how do we make sure that this is part and parcel of that relationship and that legal instruments can be used, can be applied in context when it is necessary? I'm particularly thinking about a scenario that Sarah spoke about where that remedial action, that there's been feedback, that remedial that has been proposed actually hasn't been done. And the issue has now been escalated into the judicial space. How do we handle that element of the relationship?
Right, thanks for the question, Nazipa. And it's not really particularly our area of focus as a Global Compact, but for me, I think that's really where this piece of social dialogue really does come in, and the importance of having that robust stakeholder discussion. Yes, remedial action is probably a close to action of last resort. I think our question and our focus and where we try to put our work as the Global Compact is how do we get to the stage where we avoid having to take that remedial action and get companies to ask the right questions at the very beginning. Actually from the Global Compact angle, one of the most asked questions we get is we understand the importance of human rights. We just don't know how to put this in place and what we need to do and what are the actions. And so we work to develop toolkits, we work to do peer learning, we work to showcase great practices. But I fully understand and appreciate the situation that at some point in time, it escalates to the court process. And our view then is that if there is, a legislative process that can go in place and look at really resolving the issue, then that's great. I think at the core of it has to be that fundamental desire to continue to protect and to promote and to support human rights as we go forward.
Sandra, before I let you go, I see Christy's raised her hand, so I'm going to come to her very quickly. I do want you to maybe talk a little bit about the online course that UN Global Compact has actually developed to assist business in implementing human rights due diligence. How does this tool work in the context of the conversation we're having?
Yeah, sure. And it's a tool that we developed actually in partnership with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and an organization called SHIFT. And I just want to reflect on something that Ngozi said, which was the due diligence is an instrument and not a goal. And so the point of a tool is to continuously allow you to take stock and assess where you are and work towards continuous improvement. So really that's the purpose of this tool. It's an e-learning course that we've developed, as I said, in collaboration, and we run it through what's called our UN Global Compact Academy as a series of 4 modules that are online, and companies can take them at any time and in any order. Reflecting on my earlier comment, a lot of companies say that they have this ambition, they're just not able to really put it in action. And if I put some numbers to it, actually, about 90% of our Global Compact participants, and here I'm talking about 13,000 or so, state that they have human rights policies in place, but only less than 20% actually conduct human rights impact assessments. And this is where these tools come into place, and they allow for this process of continuous improvement.
Sandra, it's an excellent one, and certainly a tool that I think should be on everybody's radar and within their toolbox if it isn't already. But Christy, let's bring your voice into here. You popped your hand up. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to comment on this question of access to legal remedy, because I do think that there's very few workers in the supply chain who have access to remedy through a legal process, which is why there's a discussion around a treaty which would allow cross-territorial legal access. There's a few places where it's happened, but it's hard and expensive. And I do believe, and our experience showed us with the Accord, it's very important to have that backbone. Of course, we try to resolve every problem through discussion and dialogue, but at the end of the day, we have a legally binding agreement, which is enforced not through the courts, but through arbitration. And we've used it twice, and I think having that firm, element to the Accord means that there is a level playing field. It's not just a voluntary commitment, and it does kind of raise the expectations across the board. So we've just we're working on with the Permanent Court of Arbitration another arbitration mechanism that could be used for labor disputes and embedded in our global agreements. Because I think that it kind of raises the seriousness. Of course, we would only use that as a last resort, but we don't have access to remedy for most workers right now. It's not easy. In some extreme cases of, extreme events, you could maybe get access to a European court, but otherwise it's very hard. So we're trying to create other avenues for remedy.
Yeah, it's very important texturization that you're bringing to the conversation. I want to sneak in a question to Professor Anna, and sneak in a question from Cambodia to Sarah, if I still can. So, Prof, let me bring this question to you. It comes from Anna Maria Nilsson. And the question is, are orders in the garment industry picking up again, or is the industry still suffering from the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, there's not a easy answer to it. So orders are picking up in certain segments, but there is a speed to market question that I've never seen this intense, because companies just don't know how to forecast out 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road. So the forecasting is very short term. That's one. The other, it's very uneven across countries. So major suppliers such as Vietnam have been largely on lockdown. And Vietnam was booming several months ago. As it went on lockdown, now orders are booming in Bangladesh. It was picking up some of the slack. Combined with that, there is a very renewed discussion going on now about nearshoring. We look at the disruptions in shipping, right? The container costs, these bottlenecks, these backups at the ports. It's a huge crisis. All the news this morning was about Long Beach and Los Angeles ports. Companies are now looking, oh, maybe we should move out of Asia and bring production to Latin America for the US, to Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey for Europe. So there's a lot of disruption and flux going on. And my point would be, this is precisely the time that we need social dialogue. We need to get workers involved with the companies in these discussions and really find a way that we navigate this difficult time together in a participatory way so that workers are not adversely affected in this transition.
Prof, I'm going to sneak one more in before I get to Sayan and wrap it up. And I feel like this question is so big, it could be a master's topic, but you would know better than I do. And the question's from Rosen van Wolveren from Fairway. And Rosen is saying, how do we go about building the capacity of local unions? Are they even strong enough to bring up the issues and connect those issues to the purchasing practices of companies? So Rosen's quite concerned about the issues are important, but the capacity of the local unions, are they even a match?
Yes, indeed. This was one of the reasons why we started to discuss with our own union, and in the end came up with the idea to partner with the international union to in that with that tool sort of find a way to go around to help them with capacity building, etc., and to have someone who can support and be a mentor for these sometimes very small unions locally in, for example, South Africa. So I think, well, the risk is there, no doubt.
Absolutely, and I mean the risk is there, especially in small unions. Professor Anna, what's your thought on that question as well? The capacity of local unions to actually carry the nature and the kind of issues that we're talking about, and the capacity to really connect them to the purchasing practices of companies.
I'm in that sense optimistic. I think the capacity is there. It's the question of finding the right mechanisms to empower workers. And I just want to mention something about how I'm doing this research, what I did in Guatemala, what I'm doing now in Honduras. We're trying to move towards a model of what we're calling worker-driven research. So actually, I'm setting up teams of worker activists, worker rights activists, and they're doing the surveys. We have, last night I was on the call, we are on these long Zoom calls with workers. They get it. I mean, they understand this. The question is finding again those mechanisms so their voices are heard. And I think this brings us back to the global framework agreements, what I also call global binding agreements. It brings us back to mandatory due diligence, which really very clearly and unambiguously has freedom of association rights in it. The building blocks are there. We need to pull these pieces together and empower those voices.
So
could I just add something? And I think that I agree with Mark, but also what I've seen is with fair trade, there's so many fantastic examples where fair trade really has enabled the local society and the teams at a specific production site. So I think there's so many good examples of how you can lift people to take advantage of the fair trade premium in that case, and
that's fantastic, Sarah. I see a thumbs up from Nyagoi. So I'm not going to ask her to say anything, because I do need to wrap up. But I want to wrap up in a fun way, and I want us just to do this in a really interesting way. So I want us to all think about a tweet that we're going to take out tonight. Remember, Prof, it's a tweet. It's not a thesis. It's not a dissertation. It's not an executive summary. So you, Minister, it's not a policy paper. It is a tweet. So no more than 10 words. And all I'm asking for you is to complete the sentence. And the sentence starts with due diligence. Complete the sentence with due diligence. What is possible? What could happen? That's what I'm really looking for. Sanda's got a game face on, so I'm going to go to her first. I think she might have a really strong one for us. So Sanda, with due diligence?
respect for rights is possible.
I love that. Respect for rights is possible. I can see the ministers writing away. So let me go to Christy. Christy, you've got your eyes down, but I think it's a ploy for me to not come to you next. So let me come to you, Christy, with due diligence. You're muted, Christy.
We can make it happen for workers.
We can make it happen for workers. Absolutely got that in. I've locked that in. Dr. Nyagoi, let me come back to you. With due diligence. You're muted, madam.
With due diligence and social dialogue, there is dignity for all.
There is dignity for all. It is sounding better and better, and they all are within a tweet for now. So let me go to Sarah. So, let me go to, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, with due diligence, we have the opportunity to make a real difference.
We have the opportunity to make
a real
difference. I'm writing them all down because I'm going to be tweeting them as well. So that's it. So the minister's ready. Fantastic. Minister Milero, let me make.
Muchas gracias, Nosy.
Thank you, Nosy. With due diligence, we can reinforce human capital, the main one.
Can reinforce human capital. So Prof, you've got a number of tweets. I think they could sound like potential master's thesis topics, but let's give you an opportunity to take us home on this one with due diligence.
For me, sorry, yeah.
Yes, with due diligence.
I would say with due diligence, we can empower workers and create jobs with dignity for all workers in global supply chains.
It can empower workers and create dignity for all workers in supply chains. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the beautiful thing is that I don't have to choose a winning tweet. The team is going to do that. So do look out for hashtag Global Deal Forum, hashtag social dialogue. Let's see whose tweet makes it out first today. But just to say a massive thank you to all our speakers. Your contributions have been incredible. They've been practical. They've activated the building blocks that Professor Anna said we have, but we just need to act on them. And just some beautiful sound bites that have come out of today, but a lot of depth in the conversation as well. Now, to our global audience, allow me to thank you for your robust questions. They were absolutely excellent and added so much value to this conversation. What we're going to do now is take a 30-minute break. We're going to reconvene at 1600 hours, and that's for a partner session where we're really inviting you to join us. It's a session led by the ILO, looking at how social dialogue can help achieve universal access to social protection. Don't forget that tomorrow at 10 a.m., we're also going to kick off with the partner session led by the OECD that will focus on social dialogue in the post-pandemic changing world of work. We're going to kick off session 4 tomorrow at 1400 hours, just as we did today. It's been absolutely incredible being with all of you today. Thank you so much. And it's a massive goodbye for me for now, and hope to see you at the partner session at 1600 hours. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you very much to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very well moderated.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nosy.